Hi, I'm Lauren Centrella, Interim Chief Development Officer at WAMU. I'd like to thank you all for attending the event this afternoon and welcome you to the author series. We're thrilled that you've signed up to join our book Horse discussion today. WAMU has deep roots as a media organization in service of the community. We are truth seekers and storytellers. We strive to expand our listeners' horizons, stir their souls, and help them engage in real and meaningful ways with their local, regional, and global community. And these author series do just that. This event and others like it are possible because of your donations. Please consider making an additional donation at dianerehm.org/give. It's the donations made by you that help us produce these events. Please welcome our host, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome to all of you to the latest conversation in my author interview series, part of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Geraldine Brooks. She started her career as a journalist, worked as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal for more than a decade. Once she switched to fiction, she quickly found success with Year of Wonders and March, winner of the 2006 Pulitzer Prize. Geraldine actually appeared on the Diane Rehm show to talk about each of her 5 previous novels, and I'm thrilled to get her to talk about her latest, Horse. It's based on the true story of a 19th century champion racehorse. The book leaps through time, connects past to present. It's eye-opening, moving, and simply a wonderful read. If you have questions for Geraldine, type them in the Q&A box of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. Geraldine, it's so good to see you again.
It's absolutely wonderful to see you, Diane, and it's a pleasure to be a part of your book club.
Thank you. Now, I gather you yourself became a horsewoman in later life. It wasn't something you did as a child.
Absolutely. I managed to miss becoming horse crazy at 5 or 15, but I did become horse crazy at 50. And I don't know that I recommend that approach. It would have been much better to start younger when I still bounced, but I'm very lucky. I have a sweet, sweet little mare, and she and I have an understanding. So far, so good.
So you, I gather, have fallen a few times.
Well, everybody falls.
Yeah.
Everybody falls. They say you're not a rider until you've fallen off 3 times. But anyway, I haven't, I'm touching every piece of wood handy here. I haven't fallen off my Valentine yet. So all good.
Now, I want to start this with a difficult question for you. You had begun writing Horse when your dear husband, Tony, died. In fact, he was giving you thoughts, putting his ideas out there. Tell me what happened. It was such a shock to know you lost him.
I know it was the biggest shock of my life. Anybody who knew Tony knew he was full of life and energy, and he was very youthful in body and spirit, and extremely fit. He went to the gym 6 times a week. And I'm afraid that he listened to Fox News to get himself agitated while he was working out. And I'm sure that wasn't very good for his heart in retrospect. But it was a beautiful day in May, and I picked up the phone to a doctor in the emergency room at George Washington Hospital GW, and they told me that he had collapsed in the street and that been unable to revive him. And I just didn't believe it. I just could not believe. He was on book tour at the time, and he would have been speaking at Politics and Prose the next day.
Oh, I remember so well coming down to Virginia and to being with both of you while I was down there. And that was such a treat for me as I was on book tour. Now, you must be doing a huge book tour for this one.
It's been very extensive. I did 2 weeks when it was first published in the US, and then I did 2 weeks in Australia, where I went to almost every city in the country. And I'm still going. I'm coming to Washington to the National Book Festival this
How
weekend.
wonderful.
Yeah.
How wonderful. And Australia is your home. So you were able to see friends and family as well as tour, I hope.
I spent most of the time that I had with my sister, who, because of COVID, I hadn't seen in 2.5 years, which is the longest we had ever gone without seeing each other. So it was a monumental hug fest, and we had a great time. And I'm going to be back there in December to spend a more relaxed visit.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, now to the book. We have just had a wonderful conversation about horse, and I want to start at the beginning of your journey. I've read that this book came into your mind when your publishers were thinking about having you do another book.
It was actually a great friend at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum who they'd been super helpful to me when I was researching my novel Caleb's Crossing, about early contact between English settlers and Native Americans. And so I was at a lunch at the museum, and he was pitching me the idea to do a book about a young woman from the plantation. And I thought it was a lovely idea, except it was too similar to the book I'd already written, which had a female protagonist of the same era. And I'd lived in the head of this young Calvinist girl for 5 years, and I didn't want to go back there. But I was nodding and smiling politely when I started to catch snatches of the conversation down the table, where an official from the Smithsonian Institution, Harold Kloster, was regaling his luncheon companions with his latest mission, which had been to transport the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century from a dusty attic in the Smithsonian in Washington to pride of place in a brand new exhibit in the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky. And as he unspooled the story of this horse's racing career and his incredible blistering speed and stamina and courage, and then what happened to the horse during the Civil War, I almost turned to my lovely friend and said, could you pipe down about that girl? Because I just need to hear about this horse.
So that led you then, I'm sure, to a conversation with the person who was telling that story.
Well, definitely, because, it arrived at a fortuitous moment, because I had just started on my ruinous horse habit. And as anybody who knows who's had horses, you know, that they consume your thoughts, your time, and your fortune very quickly. So this idea came about just when I needed it, because I could unite my new passion with my professional work. And so that was terrific. So yes, I hunted down Harold Cluster, and he introduced me to many, many helpful people at the Smithsonian. And I learned all about osteoprep, and I learned about the treasure house that is the Museum Support Center out in Maryland, where all kinds of science and research happens, and where most of the Smithsonian collections are stored. 98% of what they have is in Suitland, Maryland.
Had you ever heard of Lexington before that conversation?
No, I hadn't. And I was thrilled when I mentioned the horse to other horse people that they hadn't either. And it's extraordinary, because the horse was a big celebrity in his own time. Presidents came to watch him race. General Custer made a pilgrimage to the farm where he was standing stud because he wanted to see the finest racehorse that some people say had ever existed. And when he died, his obituary ran over 3 pages. So, you know, this was a celebrity, and yet he'd fallen right out of the public mind.
Why do you suppose that was? I mean, we still hear about Seabiscuit. We still hear about some of the great ones of this last half century, surely, and more. But why do you think Lexington had just sort of disappeared?
It's quite remarkable, given that his fame did endure, way beyond his racing career, because he fathered so many champions. He was the greatest stud stallion of all time.
Wow.
Yeah, so he, Preakness, the horse for which the race is named, is one of his sons. Cincinnati, the horse that General Grant rode to war, was one of his sons. Aristides, the winner of the first Kentucky Derby, was one of his sons. And the list of champions is a mile long that he fathered.
So what a story to get into. How did you begin? And did you know as soon as you started that you were on the right track for what your heart needed?
Well, no, I had a big wobble, actually, because it soon became very apparent to me that this couldn't just be a story about a racehorse. Because as I began to research Lexington and how he was bred and trained, I realized the absolutely essential role of Black horsemen and the thoroughbred industry, which was huge in the 19th century. It was a national obsession, was built on the plundered labor of enslaved Black horsemen whose expertise and knowledge was absolutely crucial to the success of these racehorses. So I was diving into that area, and then, I got very interested in the paintings that exist of this horse that were done during the horse's own lifetime. And one of them is described as Lexington being led out by Black Jarrett, his groom.
Black Jarrett.
And in the accounts of the horse's travels from racetrack to racetrack, there are often references to him being taken in the company of a darky. And so we're right into the brutal system of enslavement. And I hadn't expected to go there. And then, it's a braided narrative, as you said, as it leaps through time, because I wanted to explore the science at the Smithsonian as well. And I wanted to explore some mysteries around the paintings of the horse. So that took us to the 1950s, and then to the present day, essentially. And I thought to myself, I can't just leave the story of race and injustice in the 19th century as if it's something that's over and done with. because it isn't. And so it was going to have to echo in the present day story as well. And I
What
knew that that was going to be, it's controversial for a white writer to go in that direction these days.
And you had real doubts as to going in there and what the reaction might be toward you, a white woman from Australia, getting into as much as you could the reality of slavery in those days and the heart of Jared.
Well, that's right. But so, I just, I thought to myself, I can't tell this story unless I ground it on the story of these men whose expertise led to the horse's successes. And I could have gone another direction. I could have centered it on the white owners, who are very interesting characters in their own right, and they're in the book. But I thought it would be another injustice to erase the role of the Black Horseman. So I knew I'd just have to pull on my big girl trousers and try and do my best.
What did Tony think of the idea of
Oh,
horse?
he loved this idea.
He loved it.
Much more, he was very so about my previous novel about King David. He didn't like plunging into biblical mythology one little bit, but he loved this period because he knew so much about it. And he at the time was working on his nonfiction work, Spying on the South, which tragically is his last book. But there are a lot of overlaps. We didn't know this, but it turns out that many of the characters, his book is about Frederick Law Olmsted's travels through the South just prior to the Civil War. And he travels in Kentucky and he meets many of the people who were connections of Lexington, and very close connections in the case of Cassius Clay, who is a fascinating character in his own right. And so we traveled to Kentucky and did our respective research together, and we took our youngest son with us, and it was really a marvelous trip. And Tony was immensely helpful to me in ferreting out sources because, he's a genius in the archives.
Your youngest son is one you adopted from Nigeria, is that correct?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, forgive me.
No, not
And his name, pronounce it for me.
Well, his full name is Bizwayo, which is Amharic for I have seen a lot.
Huh.
And he was 5 when he came home to us, and I just dropped him off at college, so time flies. But
wow.
So we shortened his name because that was a lot for a kindergartner to have to write. So we shortened it to Bizu, which is the part of the name that means abundance.
I see.
It suits him because he is an abundant personality.
How wonderful that you have seen him through these years and now off to college. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Yeah, we're very happy because he's extremely happy to be finally there. Yeah.
I was absolutely fascinated by your presentation of detail as far as horse racing goes. Not only the kind of training that the horse must go through and indeed endure, but the soil, how it moves, how a horse moves through it. You did so much research on that. Was that something that you loved doing?
Oh, I love doing research. I must admit, a great fan of horse racing because I have grave concerns about the welfare of the equines that are involved in it. But I have to say that in the 19th century, horse racing was completely different. They didn't start the horses at such a young age as we do now. And the races were long. They were 4-mile heat races. So the best horses were able to race 4 miles 3 times in the one day, which is
Wow.
incredible. We think the Kentucky Derby is a long race. These races were twice as long as that. And it was easy to research the horse part of the novel because this was such a national obsession that there were 3 newspapers devoted to covering the thoroughbred industry and the races. So every hoof beat that horse took was documented. So I was able to read these very vivid accounts of every race, and also, lots and lots of interviews with the connections of the horses, and it was just a very lively press that covered the turf in those days.
He, as you said, sired many horses, but from whom did Lexington come?
Oh, he has a very interesting pedigree too. All of the thoroughbreds come from 4 initial thoroughbred horses. And so you can see his descent the whole way, but his sire was a fantastically fast horse who had a very angry disposition because he'd been so ill-treated. He was a hard horse to bring under saddle, and in those days their techniques to do that were brutal. And this horse was, would have been a killer if he could have. He bit and he stomped and he threw his riders, and he didn't want any part of it. But on the track, he was almost unbeatable. And so that was the father of Lexington. And then his mother was a mare who was very fast, but also had the wrong temperament for racing. She would be very fast when she was at home on her farm, but when they took her to the track, she would fall apart as a bundle of nerves. So she wasn't a very successful racehorse, but she was a very good mother. And so that's his family story.
Well, the fascinating part to me is a question of, was Lexington, as you suggest in the book, so tied to Jarrett, he was there as the foal was born, was his temperament created by Jarrett?
Well, we don't really know very much about the actual Jarrett. I tried to discover more about him.
I know you did.
But there isn't much. And so I built a character for him from various sources. Some of the Black horsemen who are better documented, some of them who gave oral histories. So I took some bits from there, and then I gave Jarrett all my own feelings about horses and all my own experience with my own horse. And then I must admit, there's a little bit of my son's personality in him too, because he's a very contained young man who keeps his own counsel, but has very deep thoughts and opinions. So I was thinking about him and my love of horses and how I interact with them and what it takes to form that bond of love and trust with an animal that looks at the world so differently to the way we do, because we're predators and they're prey. So to make that jump of interspecies communication is a bit harder than it is with our beloved dogs. I know you've got your dog there, I've got my dog here, and we're looking at the world in the same way, like, what are we going to eat next? Whereas the horse is looking all around to say, what is coming to eat me? So
Interesting way to put it. There is one scene in the book where a horse that is expected to win is thrashed so badly during the race because Lexington is clearly going to win that the horse dies the next day.
That was unfortunately true. You know, as I said, all of these races were extremely well documented. And there was a lot of controversy about running that mare in the second heat against Lexington when she was so clearly exhausted. So, yeah, they raced that horse to exhaustion. And I'm sorry to say, you know, horses die on the racetrack at an appallingly high number, especially in this country where we're very, very behind in the animal welfare standards. We allow the use of a diuretic called Lasix, which is terrible for horses. And we're the only civilized, so-called civilized country that still allows that to be used. So
what is it supposed to do to
well,
the
it makes the
horse?
horse, you know, diuretic, it makes the horse lighter for the race, basically. But it depletes the bones over time and it just has really awful consequences. And, you know, so I just find it very tragic. You know, my horse is 26 and her pasture mate is a former racehorse named Screaming Hot Wings. And he's 33. And these horses have so much to give, and to think that so many of them are discarded and destroyed at 5 if they didn't perform on the track. It's just a shocking waste of beautiful animals.
And what happens now to horses who race and either don't succeed or are past that point where they can succeed?
It depends on the owner, you know, so some owners are really responsible. And if the horse isn't cut out for the track, you know, they find another discipline that the horse might succeed in, like dressage or jumping or something of that nature. And so some horses go on to happy careers, but just many of them are shipped to Mexico for pet food, which is just horrible.
How long did Lexington live?
Lexington had a good long life and was very well cared for. I don't think I could have written this book. So spoiler alert, the horse does fine.
The horse does fine. We won't go into yet what happens to the other characters. One of the questions that came in for you, this one from Virginia, who says, I'm struck by the simplicity of the title horse. Could Geraldine provide some background on how that was decided?
So I wanted to call this book Horse because when I first heard the story of Lexington from Harold Klosters, he was telling us that because the horse's fame had waned, when the horse died, there was a big to-do. The obituary I already mentioned, this horse, they made a casket for this horse, very unusual, very ceremonial burial in a pasture overlooking the mayor's barn. And then a few years later, they decided that the interest in the horse was so high, they would exhume his body and send the skeleton to be mounted to be displayed at the Smithsonian, where he was displayed as Lexington, the greatest racehorse of all time. Fame wanes. The Smithsonian's mission changes. The Smithsonian goes from being more or less a 19th century cabinet of curiosities to being a scientific research organization. And they're not so interested in Lexington, the racehorse, anymore. They're interested in Equus cabalus, horse, and how Lexington's skeleton is an example of that species. And so for a long time, Lexington was just in the Hall of Mammals as an example of a horse, next to an example of a rabbit and an example of an elk. So I love the idea that he was just horse for a century or so.
An anonymous horse.
Yes.
Have you seen this skeleton?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I made my pilgrimage to the International Museum of the Horse, and he is now in a beautiful display with one of the oil paintings created during his lifetime blown up behind him. So you can see the skeleton with the image of the horse behind. And it's a exhibit that tells the history of the thoroughbred in America. And it's very appropriate because the reason that Lexington, Kentucky is the center of thoroughbred breeding in America is because of Lexington and his progeny.
Does the skeleton tell you anything about why this horse became the most famous in US history?
Well, I talked to a lot of scientists about what bones can tell you. And he does have a very massive backbone. So that would account for his stamina and strength. The speed, it's not clear. That comes more from he's got, a lot of space for lung action, but without the organs, most great racehorses have very, very large hearts to pump the blood. So I imagine that he did. But we don't know exactly that, but it's more than that. I mean, it was his personality as well that made him so great. This was a horse who really loved to win. And we know that because in one of his races, his racing plates, the light shoes they put on racehorses, had come loose. So he was running. It must have been very painful, but he just wanted to do it because nobody was, in that case, thrashing him to do it. He was a horse who loved the speed of, and he didn't even need pacemakers. He would be miles ahead and keep going faster.
And he rode low.
Yes, they say he looked like an elastic band. He would stretch himself out.
What a sight that must have been. And thousands of people coming to see the races he was in.
30,000, crammed into the track. Most of his great races were in New Orleans. And so that was where, people just came from all over the country really to see him race. And it was it must have been so exciting because there's a lot more tactics when you're running for 4 miles than there can be if you're only running a mile or so.
We talked a little about Jared. You tried to find out about him. How far were you able to get?
Not far, because we know that he existed, not just because of him being named in the painting, but he's also in the records of the farm. The owner of that farm, quite unusually, started to pay his enslaved people at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, which people in Kentucky were not obliged to do, but he did that. And it's interesting that many of the people he had enslaved stayed in his employ until his death, and then they went on to have careers elsewhere. But so that's basically it. I know he was there and that he was emancipated, and apart from that, I really don't. So that's where the novelist job.
Do you know for a fact that he was there when Lexington was born?
No, I do not know that.
So that was part of your creative genius.
Well, I do know that, it's not the owners, it's not the jockeys, it's the grooms who have the bonds with the horse. They're the ones who are there day after day, doing the feeding, doing the care, doing the brushing, spending the time. And so I knew that I wanted to tell the story of the bond with the person who's closest to the horse.
Here's a question from Linda. Ms. Brooks' knowledge of and writing about horses, their temperament, their care, ailments, etc., is accurate and extensive, adding so much to the story. Was or is she a horse person? We know that. She'd love to hear how you gained your knowledge.
So I became a horse person by accident. I was at a writer's retreat in New Mexico, and it was on a sort of genteelly shabby ranch, beautiful place. And my room just happened to overlook the corrals that were full of wonderful paint horses and Appaloosas, and I was admiring them. And one of the wranglers said, "You should come on a trail ride with us." And I said, "I can't ride." And he said, "Yes, you can. These horses won't let you fall off. They know their job." And the next day I was following behind him, and we were cantering along the arroyos, these beautiful, it's just an ecstatic experience. And I came home, I was full of that experience. And a few nights later, a young friend came to dinner, and I was telling her about how great it was. And she looked out my window and she said, "You've got a couple of acres here. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse." Well, there are many questions I could have asked, but instead I just set about fencing half my property and turning my tool shed into stalls and learning about horse transport, because this horse was not close by.
Oh my.
This horse was in Mexico.
Oh my gosh.
A free horse from Mexico. No such thing. But anyway, she was a beautiful horse, and she was so beautiful that she was featured in a television commercial for a fast-acting antifungal cream for vaginal yeast infections. And so she before we could arrange the transport, I must have watched that out a million times. The horse gallops across the screen and the voiceover says, "Some things should be fast." Anyway, she was a gorgeous Palomino mare, but she was way too much horse for me. She was used to expert riders and cowboys. And so I fell off her a couple of times and then found her a rider who actually knew how to ride. And luckily then got my quiet and gentle older mare who suits me perfectly.
That's lovely. And do you pretty much ride every day?
Not now, I don't, but I spend time with the horses every day. I do all the horse care, so I'm a bit of a groom myself now. To be honest, I kind of started to get cautious about riding after Tony died, because I realized that my two sons have just got me, and if having even a trivial accident would have an impact on them, because then they'd be required to put their life on hold and look after me, and I can't put that on them. So we do a lot of ground games and we have a lot of fun, and I spend time with her and screaming hot wings and give them breakfast every morning, and it's delightful. And also we volunteer in a program for children with disabilities.
Oh,
and
great.
an amazing rapport between horses and
Why do you think that is? Tell me about what happens between those children and the horses.
So I think it's because horses are so sensitive, because they have to be so aware of their environment to be ready to flee from threats. And I think it's, because like people with PTSD or emotionally disturbed people, I think often feel like prey. I think they've often been in situations where they're in danger and they feel preyed upon. And I think that means there's a kind of empathy. It's one of those wonderfully unfathomable things, but it is true. I see it. Some of the children in the program have autism, and they arrive and they're very disorganized in their behaviors. And then the minute you put them on the horse, they gain calm and focus and
Yes, yes. After Tony died, since you had already begun horse, Were you able to continue?
Not for a while, not for a while. It took me about a year to get back to it, but he had been so instrumental in the research for the book, and he was so enthusiastic about it that I really wanted to finish it, partly, as something I could dedicate to him. And also, it was a bit of advice that came through a friend who was an NPR reporter who had been bereaved and had got the advice from Nina Totenberg, who had got it from Justice Ginsburg,
Yes.
who had said to her, do your work. It might not be your best work, but it will be good work, and it will be what saves you. And so Deborah Amos passed that on to me. So it's a long chain of transmission. And
Yes.
it turns out to be the absolute truth, because the book became the lifeboat that I eventually allowed myself to climb into.
I agree with that advice. Two things. Nina Totenberg will be our guest on the book club next month. And when my husband died of Parkinson's, I think I waited just 2 weeks before I got back on the air. I just had to keep working.
Mhm.
It does help, but with a writer, I can imagine that had to be quite difficult for you.
Yeah, I couldn't really focus for a long time, and you really have to be down quite a rabbit hole to hold all the characters in your head. And part of it was grief, and part of it was just the hideous complexity of the bureaucracy that falls on your head when somebody leaves suddenly, as Tony did. That I was
Absolutely.
catching anvils falling out of the sky, so.
Another comment from Elizabeth, who says the race course scenes where horses die that Ms. Brooks writes about might shock a reader, but in truth, what happens to many of today's thoroughbreds after their racing days are over is equally shocking. Racetracks and aftercare organizations are working hard to address this problem.
Yeah, that is true, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think that partly the decline in popularity of racing reflects people's concern over the welfare of the horses.
And Jim writes, in addition to the prominent theme of race and racial inequality in horse, Ms. Brooks also addressed the issue of race in her earlier novel, March. I'm wondering if Ms. Brooks could comment on how her thinking on race has changed over the years between these two books.
Yeah, I think like everybody, I've been on a learning journey. I think the tendency has been to lament the sins of the past as if the past is past, but as Faulkner said, the past is not even past. And I wasn't aware of the exclusion of Black Americans from the New Deal. They did not benefit in the way that white Americans did from the economic opportunities. They did not benefit from the GI Bill. The story of redlining and how it persists, the denial of credit, the inability to accrue wealth through owning your own home because of the denial of credit. All of these things still impact lives, even today. And what happened in Virginia during massive resistance, where the public schools were closed because people refused to integrate them, and the white children went to private schools and the Black children had no schooling at all for a number of years. And so I think when people want to say that's all so long ago and, we're post-racial because we had a Black president, I think we've all, or we should have all learned better.
And indeed, I think many of us have. Now, a question from Jenny about perhaps, and we've gotten so many similar questions. Did the author explore or consider alternative endings? She goes on to say, I was sad the book ended the way it did, even though I had been expecting something along those lines of Theo having an altercation.
I think
with the
we shouldn't, I don't want to really go into any more detail about what happens to the characters because some people might not yet have got there. And I will just say that ending surprised me too. And I think it is reflective of the grief that I was experiencing and the loss that I was experiencing. So I'd rather not talk in more detail about it, but it was very much influenced by events that were happening as I was writing the book, both in the wider community and in my own heart. So
I can certainly understand that. And I want you to know that in the last hour, with our 3 scholarly participants, before we began to talk about the ending, I said to the audience, if you have not yet read the book, this is a spoiler, so you may want to get off this Zoom call. And I saw that we lost over 100 callers immediately. So I feel the same way you do. And I realize that your heart was really in those last chapters, as it was throughout the book, but in a very different way in that last portion. Was it important to you to have the middle portion in 1954, I think it was, and the real characters of Jackson Pollock and his wife and his agent, and then, of course, bring in a Mellon, and a Mellon did actually buy one portrait. I gather he was a horse lover.
He had thoroughbreds, wonderful racehorses, Paul Mellon, and he also was an avid equestrian himself. So so this middle portion of the book, when I set out to write this book about a 19th century racehorse, I had no idea it was going to lead me right to Jackson Pollock, and yet it did. So it's the story of one of the paintings that was made of Lexington. And that painting came to the Smithsonian as part of a bequest from a feminist gallerist called Martha Jackson, who was a remarkable woman and a real pioneer in the art world of New York in the 1950s. She was the promoter and the benefactor and the proponent of the edgiest contemporary art of the day that really changed our aesthetics about art. And so it was quite extraordinary that her bequests to the Smithsonian were really wonderful examples of that edgy contemporary art, except for this one realistic, traditional oil portrait of Lexington the horse. And I just wondered, why did Martha Jackson have that? And that just sent my novelist imagination reeling. And of course, so I couldn't resist including that element to the story.
But how much of that element of the story is factual and how much was truly your imagination?
Well, I'm not going to spell that out too much either, because I think that's part of the fun of reading the book, but I do spell it out in the afterword. So you can find out after you've read the account how much is and how much isn't. But I can tell you this, which is true for the book as a whole: the more outlandish and unlikely something sounds, the more likely it is to be true. So the true things are the least likely things.
And for Paul Mellon to own,
He didn't actually own it, but he had it in his possession.
oh,
And
I
then-
see.
And then she got it back. And we don't know exactly what happened in that transaction, because I couldn't find any correspondence that detailed it. Somebody may well know, but I wasn't able to track down what happened. But I think that my account is pretty plausible, that she left it with him for his consideration. But it was with Paul Mellon for a time.
And finally, while you were writing this, the country was going through a real racial reckoning.
Convulsion, I would say. Yeah.
Indeed. And that period is not at an end, as we sort of see the shootings that continue in neighborhoods all over the country each and every day. So, how much of that played into your feelings as you were writing?
I think a tremendous amount of it, and I just was in Buffalo. That was where I did my last book event. And of course, the absolute tragedy of the Top supermarket, where people were hunted down and murdered just because they were Black. We've got so much work to do. I live on Martha's Vineyard, which has had a Black community here for more than 100 years, because it was one of only 2 places in this country where Black people could go to the beach in summer. And so it's a pretty affluent community. It's an influential community. But one thing I have learned for sure from my friendships in that community is that affluence in education is no protection if you have Black skin. And I think an instance that everybody will probably remember happened to my friend and neighbor here on the island, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates, who's a Harvard professor, who was hauled off his front porch in handcuffs for trying to open his own front door. So, there was a lot going on before 2016, but I think a lot of the ugliness that had been shoved under the carpet was allowed to emerge in those years after 2016. And I think we're still grappling with the awful, ugly divisions that have been exposed.
Will you give yourself a break now? Or
No.
have you already begun a new work?
Oh, I finished one. It's very short. It's more of a extended essay in book form, and it's about an Australian author for a series in Australia where they ask one Australian writer to appreciate the work of another. So I did that while I was waiting for this book to come out. And I am going to take a little break when I go back to Australia in December. But then in the new year, I'm going to get straight to work on the next thing, because I really do think work is my best friend right now.
Do you want to stay in this country, or do you eventually see yourself back in Australia?
I'm very Australian. You would have to be a terrible chill to complain about living on Martha's Vineyard, which is really one of the most beautiful places to live.
Yes, yes.
I do miss Australia tremendously. And I always used to tell Tony, you know, I'm only here because of you. And now I know that that's not true because I've got 2 American children. And how did I let that happen?
But surely they have been to Australia.
Oh, yes. Well, my oldest son spent half of his elementary schooling there, so he feels very Australian. But by the time he reached high school and by the time Bizu came home to us, it was not possible to be taking him back and forth in that way and messing with his education. So Bizu hasn't had as much experience of Australia, unfortunately. But hopefully we can rectify that in the future.
Well, Geraldine Brooks, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time to be with us. This is absolutely just a wonderful book. I reread it because I read it the minute it came out, and then I wanted to read it closer to the time of this interview. And I loved it even more the second time.
Well,
So
you've made my day. Thank you so much.
I can only thank you, and I hope to see you after you've written your next book.
I hope so too. That would be marvelous. Thank you, Diane. It's
Thank
always
you.
wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Geraldine. And our next meeting will be on Wednesday, September 28th. I'll be interviewing NPR's own Nina Totenberg with her new memoir, Dinners with Ruth. I hope that you'll take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event that's going to pop up on your screen. And if you would, consider a donation to WAMU. Your financial support is what makes it possible for us to bring you events like this one. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Rashad Young has been our engineer today. Yanlin Zhang is our events manager. And of course, we couldn't do it without the support of Lauren Centrella, Verendra Silva, James Coates, Dave Tate, Jerry Washington, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thank you to all of them and to all of you for participating in today's discussion. I look forward to seeing you next month with Nina Totenberg. Have a great day. Bye-bye.